So we could talk about the An Tir Rebellion if you want.
Sure, that would be great.
And the making of the kingdom. I shouldn't kick that off with saying the An Tir Rebellion, because the making of the kingdom was a process. It didn't happen really quickly. But An Tir was such a dynamic place. There was so much going on. Baronies were being formed pretty quickly. We had a lot of cohesion. There was a lot of a very Viking culture that was prevalent in those days. You know, look at all the various names, Steingrim and Ulfred and people down in Adiantum, who many of them were Viking persona or Norwegian persona. So we were really kind of different from the Kingdom of the West. And our fighters were taxed to spend a lot of time going from where they were to down to the Kingdom of the West in order to be seen by fighters there. And our officers were, sometimes it was hard to make contact with the people in the Kingdom of the West. And the board of directors was composed entirely of people in the West, even though the board of directors was serving everyone in the known world, which at that point, I believe, was 4 kingdoms. It was East, West, Middle, and Atenveld, because Atenveld had been formed in like 1972, they became a kingdom.
It's a tough story to tell. The An Tir petitioned, as I recall, 3 times to become a kingdom. And the first time, at the time you had to have, I believe it was 100 people on a mailing list or as members to become a kingdom. Second time it was 200 people. And the third time it was 400 people. Now that's my memory. I could be off on that, but it escalated every time we did it, and it was turned down twice. Just, nope, not going to do it. Board of directors, forget it. Nah. King of the West, nope, not gonna approve that. Nope. But the third time, I had one West crown, and I got to preside over the first An Tir crown tourney as King of the West. I timed it exactly wrong. It was a difficult thing to get done because it took organization, we took petitions, we had to meet all sorts of requirements and show we could do this and that and the other thing. You know, after we've been beating the West in An Tir West War, 5 years in a row, flat out, beat them all with less numbers, usually. People showed up at Western events, 12th night, and the board of directors finally said, okay, I guess we have to. There was a lot of backdoor smoky room dealing going on that I wasn't involved in. I was on the throne of An Tir for part of that, and then I was on front of the West for part of it. So I kind of had to recuse myself from some of that.
Mm. Well, we're going to be interviewing Rowenna de Manning is it next week? And I bet she has more of the story to tell.
Yeah, she was in a lot closer to a lot of that than I was.
We felt that it was getting time for us to become independent because of the distance question, the culture question, the response part question. And it was interesting to hear Steingrim last week say that there were 3 different petitions that were sent down to the Kingdom of the West before the third one was the successful one, but the other 2, which I didn't know about, I wasn't involved, I guess, in those areas at that time, but 78. Late 1977, and Edward Zafran was prince. I think it was, I can't remember the princess at that time. And there was a movement among various different people, especially in the Madrona area and central area, that we really needed to become a new kingdom. It was time, it was really, and they called themselves the An Tir Rebellion. And, there was a Star Wars tie-in. And
of course there was.
And there was quite a lot of conversation about we're being held back. It's time. And we asked the board of directors what it is that needs to be done. You know, we've got to have population, got to have functioning people who are in administrative positions, got to have well-run events that happen regularly and things like that. We were like, well, yeah. So that group was very enthusiastic about that, and they had been talking to Edward Zafron, and they were saying, well, why don't we just do it? Why don't we just break away from the SCA, form our own nonprofit organization, and we can do this different thing, kind of parallel with the SCA. And it's possible there were some organizations that had formed at that time, like Mark Haven and a couple of others that had been at Penzic, and were sort of parallel, but not exactly like the SCA. That may have been something that inspired them. I wasn't part of the group, and I don't recall talking a lot to them. But the upshot was that it became known that Edward Zafron had talked to Manfred and Caressa, who were the crown prince and crown princess coming in, the Torniston Tenista is what we called them, to say, well, we can just kind of do this at 12th night. I will declare myself king, and then I'll crown you king, and we'll have this nonprofit organization, and we'll just kind of go from there. And the phrase is, Gerhard and Amanda found out about it and were upset. And so they made a phone call to their people that they knew quite well, which was King Paul and Queen Carol. And Paul had been coming for fighting activities and in support of Antir a lot, and we knew him. And he was not very happy, but he couldn't come to Antir for whatever reason he couldn't. So he appointed a couple of people to be his envoys for 12th night. And it was Gerhard and Theodulf. And they were appointed viceroys and carried white rods. So 12th night opens, and there's a lot of people wearing these gray armbands. And somehow there was a kind of a spontaneous movement for other people to wear purple armbands. And that was the Royalists and the Rebellion.
I was not an An Tir Rebellion person. I was actually more of a West Royalist kind of a person. Although I was fairly low key. When the rebellion was going on and the whole thing was happening, I was hanging out with the folks that were dealing a lot with the background stuff, if you will, working to help the process work through being support cast to people that were having important meetings about how we were going to proceed and not have everybody hate each other. So I don't want to go into the details that I do remember. And there was a lot that I was unaware of, I'm sure. But yeah. So, but I didn't make a big deal out of it. I just wasn't a gray armband wearing person. So.
The point came that Gerhard and Amanda, this touched on fealty, and this touched on our relationship with the whole organization. So there was a meeting called, Steingrim talked about the back rooms and the smoky rooms and the things. This is one of those smoky room ones that there's a number that happened. But various people took the people who wanted to be rebellion, including Prince Edward Zafron, into a back room. And for 2.5 hours, there was a long discussion of the pros and cons, and then, no, we don't want this. And what have we done to actually try to fulfill the requirements that the board has asked for becoming a kingdom? Have we done that? Do we know what that checklist is? Have they given us the word? And one of the people in the room was Edward the Stuffy. And so it was Gerhard and Edward and Zafron and various other people. And Gerhard and Edward convinced Zafron that it was not the right thing to do. They even had a nonprofit organization all set up. And so they were convinced not to. And so when court started, Zifron, instead of, I don't know if he intended this, Napoleonic sort of thing of crowning himself king so he could then crown Manfred king. Instead, he said, I will hold the crown in trust for the future king of An Tir. And then he crowned Manfred prince. And so An Tir was preserved as a part of the SCA, quite frankly. And then we then embarked on 2 or 3 years worth of really consolidating An Tir, getting our population numbers, doing newcomer events, using I wouldn't say using, but the University of Ithra was an excellent means for getting everyone on the same page, really beginning our cultural cohesion. There were more baronies. There was a lot of more travel between branches. We used to think driving 12 hours was no big deal. And in the West, they were like, this is one of the things that I wondered if the kings, whether the fighters who were entering the lists in the West, did they think about this? They were like, okay, if I win, I'm going to have to drive to An Tir at least twice, aren't I? Did they think that? I don't know, but that was what we wanted. We wanted to see the crown at least once per reign. And so we, over the next 2 or 3 years, we built this whole structure of An Tir. And then at 12th night, 1981, we sent in a petition that was actually sent to the board, to the King, the Queen of the West, reviewed at the next board meeting, and we found out in August, or it couldn't have been in August, it was a little earlier than that. Sometime in the summer, we found out that the board had approved it. Huge sigh of relief, and then suddenly flurry of activity because we had to form a kingdom committee. There had already been the beginnings of a kingdom committee, but we had to form a formal kingdom committee and get everything all in line to have laws, ceremonies, awards, peripheral heraldry, officers, everything all lined up, including, and we had to set up doing a first crown tourney, which was going to be held in September, and that was at the in Lionsgate at the Boy Scout camp. And Edward the Stuffy took on the job of being the head of that committee and got everyone all the roles were fulfilled, all the work was fulfilled. It was actually a lot of fun to finally be going, it was so cool. So we had this crown tourney that was our crown tourney. And there was an Ontarian on the throne. It was so cool.
Do you remember how big the first crown tourney was?
As I recall, it was like 80-some entrants, which astonished the Westerners in attendance. Astonished. There were just 20, 30 people, or less. And we were, all the Ontarians like, yeah, so the cornets are, 110 at one time, 87 one, small one in Eastern Washington, be 60-some. They were astonished.
It was very, very wonderful to have Ontarians being presiding over this important event.
Fred, my ex-squire, and the current reigning last Prince of An Tir was Ulfred. So the three amigos were on the thrones at the end of the tournament. Grand finale to that era.